Hi everyone. Welcome back to World History before 1500. I hope you had a good break. This is our first lecture after the spring break, and I hope you've made a lot of progress on your object papers. Hopefully those are on their way. You should certainly have an object and probably all your sources worked out by now. Ideally, you're working on the paper and coming along with it at this point. I want to today give you a kind of a bonus lecture. I'm not going to necessarily align with the textbook today, what we've specifically been reading in the text today, because now that you're coming back from break, it's probably time for a bit of a reminder of what we've been doing in this course, and also to cover filling in some areas on the map that we haven't really gotten to talk about yet. So today I'm going to talk about both the civilizations we've already studied, where they are, around the turn of the first millennium of the Common Era, or AD. So around the year 0 to maybe around the year 500 is the focus today, which is basically where we find ourselves in most of the places we've been studying at this point. I'm going to look a little bit at North America, Northern Europe, Korea and Japan, Southeast Asia and Oceania, or actually I think that should say South America, mostly it's South America. And we're going to talk a little bit about how the world is beginning to connect, and we're going to look back at the things we've looked at so far while looking at some of these blanks in the map. And today's reading is from textbook chapter 10, 214 to 230, and we're going to cover that a little bit more next time in the next lecture, because you have two readings in a row here on kind of the early Islamic world, the early Arabic world, the dawn of Islam as a religion. And so we're going to cover that all at once in kind of a mini lecture on Thursday. There's a bunch in your textbook that covers the early Islamic world. You're reading a lot on that. So I'm not going to give you as much lecture content on that, because I'm here to fill in the gaps a little bit in lecture. That's what I'm working on doing. Anyway, two things I'm going to use today quite a bit and that you might want to have open on the side are this map of the world. This is an excellent resource that lets you go back and forth in time and then click on various parts of the world to see what was happening in those places at that time. I have it set for the year 200, which is kind of right in the middle of where we're looking at today. Some things will be a little bit earlier, some things will be a little bit later than this. But roughly speaking, in the course, we've kind of looked at all the places that you see highlighted here on the map. Early Peru, Aztec culture, the Roman Empire is established here. We see the foundations of the Arabic world, India, the Hindu Empire, the Mauryan Empire, East Asia, and the Han Dynasty. We haven't really talked about Korea or Japan, but I'm going to fill you in on those today. And that's essentially the filled in big civilizations on the map at this point in time. These are the ones that are really populous, that we know a lot about. We have a lot of both material and written sources that we can kind of combine to get a really clear sense of the history of these places in their own words. A lot of the gray areas on this map we don't know that much about in their own words. We often learn about them from others. In some cases, we learn about them from their objects, as you should be thinking about with your object paper looming, and their material culture and archaeology. And other things we find out about them from others. For example, the Romans wrote a lot about the people to the north of them in Northern Europe, and the Chinese wrote a lot about the people to the east of them in Japan, and down south in Southeast Asia. So we find out about some of these places because of the interactions that they had with larger, more established civilizations, at least in terms of their ability to write things down and keep records and have huge population centers. But I still want to fill in the map a little bit today. And then I'm also going to be using this timeline. You may have noticed I like this ancient history encyclopedia. I think it's pretty good. I definitely think it's better than like Wikipedia as a source for getting some general information. And they have an excellent timeline search that you can do, and I've linked that here. That's what these two links are on your slides. So if you ever feel like just looking at what's going on at this time around the world, you could either type it in here or look at it on this timeline, and that'll give you a nice general sense comparatively of where different places are at the same time. That hasn't really been a focus, and that isn't really a focus in this class, because I'm more interested in getting you a sense of each civilization in their own terms. I think when you tend to compare a timeline, you start to think in terms of like a competition. That is to say that, is one civilization ahead of the other in this great race that we're heading towards the present day? And that's not really that useful in actually understanding those places a lot of the time. It can be interesting in its own right, but that's not really my focus in the course. I want to give you kind of a nice full picture of each one of these places in their own right, in their own terms. Just because Japan is behind China in its writing system or something doesn't mean its civilization isn't worth studying or isn't important to world history, just for one example. And so my argument here is that we look at each one on their own. So I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. This will be a little bit longer lecture, I think, but I'm going to try to go quickly, especially through this review section at the start, because I want to review the major civilizations we've looked at least a little bit. And we'll start with Rome. I'll get myself out of the way. We're in the middle there of the Hagia Sophia. I wish I had been to the Hagia Sophia. I have not. But Rome is at its peak, roughly from 200 BCE to 400 CE. You could say 395 CE. And the empire is at its biggest, geographically speaking, around 117 AD, early in the 2nd century AD or CE. So during this period, Rome conquers most of Western Europe. It conquers up into Britain, conquers areas of Spain, all of what would become Spain, France, etc. And then begins a slow decline after this conquest of both Europe and parts of Africa and the Middle East. All the way over to the Indus, generally. Oh, not quite that far. I'm sorry, I'm mixing the Greeks up there. And then kind of declines thereafter. And in 395, Rome splits into eastern and western halves. And I'm not sure I don't think the book has covered this yet, and we will get to it here kind of this week as we start to talk about the Byzantine Empire. I don't know if this is in your reading for today or your reading for next time, but the Byzantine Empire is this Eastern Roman Empire, which is based out of Constantinople, also known as Istanbul later, which is this flourishing capital city that becomes the jewel of both the Roman and then later Byzantine, and then thereafter the Ottoman empires. So it's the wealthiest, largest, most populous city in Europe for a long period of time. And it's quite significant in that it changes hands. And I think this is the inside of the Hagia Sophia, which you may be familiar with, one of these great world sites. Here's a nice little article about it. It's this great domed church that then becomes a mosque and is today a museum. So we see this mixed imagery here. We see Arabic scripture or Arabic writing with images of Christ mixed together in this cathedral / mosque / museum, which kind of embodies the way that Constantinople and or Istanbul has shifted over time. So this is where we are in Rome. And moving right along, the Mayans, I'm going to kind of jump around the world here a little bit. The Mayan classical period, also encompasses part of the same time frame. Although Mayan history goes back much further, as we found out, some of their very large pyramid structures are quite a bit older. The real classical period of Mayan civilization is from 250 to 900 CE. which is a period in which this great central Maya lowlands right in the middle of the Yucatan Peninsula was just this very powerful, very populous place, very wealthy, and very kind of bustling civilization with a lot of cultural development, which then collapses after 900 CE. And it's long been wondered, why did the Mayans leave this place? It probably has to do with both political and environmental collapse. I have an article here for you. If you're interested in that, you can read about it. This is a very academic article, but you could just read the abstract, and that talks a little bit about it. But this central Maya lowlands is really the hotspot for Mayan civilization, Mayan mathematics, and understanding of the world around us, understanding of the cosmos, is really developing to become quite advanced during this period. We still have new discoveries happening. The reason I chose this picture is because I think it's very interesting, this image of this archaeologist who's clearly had to do quite a bit of spelunking or something to get to this cave. And just a couple of years ago, or a year ago, yeah, this is from 2019, about a year ago, they're still finding troves of artifacts from 1,000 years ago. And here we have the cave of the jaguar god, and you can listen to this, or you could watch this, or you can read this article all about it. So even though Mayan culture has these very old roots, these very large cities and towns are at their peak around this same time where we've left off here. Moving right along down south, so I guess I am technically talking kind of a little bit about North America, really Central America. And technically the Mayan world kind of bridges the southern end of North America with Central America. But in South America we have, I'm not sure if you call them the Moche or the Moche. I'm sorry, I am not an expert in this area at all. This is one of the furthest away from my area of expertise. And the Nazca. These are two pre-Incan civilizations active in Peru, what's called the early intermediate period in Peru. And these are two quite interesting advanced societies that have a similar timeline. So the Moche about 1 to 800 CE, from the turn of the first millennium to 800, the Nazca from 200 BCE to 600 CE. And these are just a sprawling group of people who are mastering this material culture of gold alloys and the use of metals, and also establishing big trade networks that we see kind of built upon even further under the Incans, who come about, many hundreds of years later. In the 15th century is really the peak of Incan civilization. But we still see quite a few pieces of evidence here from Harvard's Peabody Museum. We have this wonderful 34-page brochure for one of their exhibits, demonstrating kind of the material culture and the material history of old Peru. And I just wanted to show you this in case any of you are interested in this, in kind of pre-Incan South America. This would be a good group of people, one of these two groups, to study. In India, as we've been more recently looking, we have the Maurya Empire, the empire of Ashoka, and the Gupta Empire, which followed it a little bit later after a bit of a long period of fragmentation, almost 400 or 500 years of fragmentation. But first we have Ashoka's Mauryan Empire, which really spreads Buddhism throughout India, as you remember. And this empire lasts for 140 years, but for 50 years after the death of Ashoka, a lot of his following successors are pretty weak. And so India kind of fragments thereafter, after this establishment of Buddhism. And this is a part of why Buddhism begins to lose its kind of overarching politically supported power throughout India, is that the Mauryan Empire collapses fairly quickly. And the Guptas, if you take this article from the University of Washington, which is another one of my old websites, but if you click on each of these, you have wonderful little pieces of material culture here to look at. if we look at these coins, we see that unlike their predecessors, I'll read the quote here, the Guptas offered royal patronage to Hinduism as well as Buddhism, and their coins often included depictions of Hindu deities. So we see some coins here being used in a broader empire of the Guptas from the 3rd century to the 6th century. And once again, the kind of reemergence of Hindi culture in India, which remains quite significant and quite widespread as the dominant religion today in India. And so this is a time in which Buddhism and Hinduism are, kind of as two interrelated schools of thought, as we know, competing for patronage throughout the subcontinent. And the Guptas are particularly powerful in the north. That's kind of, if you look at a map of the Gupta Empire, it's essentially northern India that they control for the bulk of their reign. In China, we have the Han Dynasty, which you've read about in the textbook, and I didn't really present much about, but this is the real golden age for ancient China, for old China. You could say China has multiple golden ages. The Tang Dynasty and Song Dynasty are seen as another golden age that calls back to the Han. And this is really the period in which Confucianism and a state-sponsored Confucianism flourishes for about 400 years as a kind of reform government that is getting rid of the legalist traditions of the Qin, at least in their initial severity, replacing them with a Confucianism that is, state-driven, and which builds on both Confucius and his followers in creating a benevolent state. This is how it is seen historically, as a state that is helpful to its people and is successful because it provides for its citizens. This image is of a Han-era jade burial suit. Jade, as we saw in the Qin, is related to everlasting life. So imperial figures might be buried in these suits, and we see a few of them, which are almost like a suit of armor or a mummification suit made of these interlaced kind of panels or little pieces of rectangular jade. And you can look at this suit here at the Met. This is actually a different one than the picture I have, but it's the same idea. You can read about that if you're interested. So those are the major areas that we have looked at in this course so far. And we also start to see, very importantly, some of these areas are interacting more and more and more as time goes on. For example, here, China and India begin to become interrelated parts of one larger sphere of trade throughout Asia, what we call the Silk Road, which was a little bit older, but the Silk Road really becomes more well-traveled as a big network. It's not just one road. It should be called the Silk Roads. And there is a Chinese monk that is an excellent example of travel on the Silk Road, and he left behind his records. His name is Fa Shan, and you can read about him here. This is his record that he wrote down, as translated here at I think this is also the University of Washington. And so for 15 years, Fa Shan was traveling across Central Asia to India from China in search of Buddhist texts. So he's a monk, and he wants to find more accurate versions of the Buddhist scripture, the various Buddhist scriptures. And this was a very common thing. We see it happening from Japan and from Korea into China, and then further into places like India. We see it from China to India. We see it from Southeast Asia to India, and from Southeast Asia into China, in that traveling back towards the source of Buddhism is regularly an activity that monks, priests, and priestesses will take on in an effort to gain a clearer sense of the scriptures. And there's this great little video I found. I believe it's made by amateur historians, but they're basically reading a part of the account of Fa Shan, and I hope I don't get into copyright trouble by showing this here a little bit, but it's a wonderful reading of part of his journey that he's describing as he heads through Central Asia, through places like Dunhuang, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the term, and goes on this very treacherous journey to India to find the Buddhist truth. So this is a period in which the Silk Road is not at all safe. You are risking your life to go on it, especially if you're traveling far on it. But we do start to see people going on long journeys for deliberate purposes to go a very long way, rather than just kind of little steps along the Silk Road being the main or singular form of transmission. We do start to see long distance travelers mostly moving not for wealth or for goods, but for knowledge, for an information exchange. So the world is becoming more interconnected. This means that we're starting to see the map fill in for some of these places. China has a better sense of where India is, for example, and India has a better sense of where China is in this case. Places like Korea and Japan are becoming more solid in terms of how they're connected to China. And we see more and more exchange. And with this connection comes also conflict, which we see quite a lot occurring across the world between different powers. Around this time, we start to see major world conflict, like we began to see with people like Alexander the Great, which you would kind of maybe include in this period of initial conflict if you expand it out to, say, 500 BCE to 500 CE or something like that. You start to see this conflict between different cultures and different geographical places that are otherwise quite separate from each other. So these gray areas on the map. I'm not really going to talk much about North America today, but North America, if you look on this map, we have still quite a lot of movement of fairly nomadic people living still hunter-gathering lifestyles. This is also happening in Japan for a lot of this period, from 500 to 500, 500 BCE to 500 CE. Japan is quite similar in that it's excuse me, its Neolithic period essentially extends. People's lives are becoming more complex, but the way they live is still technically like a Neolithic style of hunter-gathering with a little bit of horticulture on the side, a little bit of growing food, but mostly moving around to catch things and forage, etc. This is happening in North America and parts of Asia, up into the steppe as well. The Mongols are one of the most famous ones, but as I've said before, there are lots of nomadic people in northern and central Asia whose lifestyle revolves around herding, pastoralism, and hunting, more so than around agriculture. The key vectors of receiving calories is from things like meat and cheese, and you may also trade for things like grain and vegetables, but you're also gathering quite a bit and really continuing to move around. This lack of extended periods of settlement means it's more difficult for us as historians or as archaeologists, anthropologists, to understand these people in a lot of detail until just a little bit later in history. In Northern Europe, we start to see a lot of new contention with the Roman Empire. People like the Goths, people like the Huns, the Britons, all competing with the Romans. A little bit later, we see the Vikings emerge, competing with the Anglo-Saxons for control of parts of Northern Europe, including Britain and even down into places like France. In Australia and Oceania, we have kind of mytho-history, in which, the bulk of what we know is passed down orally rather than through text, which means it kind of shifts and changes over time. I'll talk maybe very briefly about that today. Korea and Japan are becoming more and more influenced by China, and I'll have slides for each of those in a few minutes. Southeast Asia is kind of sandwiched between East Asian and South Asian, between Hindi and Buddhist/Confucian cultures. And also Southeast Asia is really kind of sandwiched between Oceania and Asia, right? Because Oceania, if we look at it, is really an extension of island Southeast Asia, geographically speaking. And then Africa, and I say Southern Africa, I really mean Africa just outside of places like Egypt, outside of the far north of Africa, places like Egypt and Rome, Roman-controlled Africa. We see quite a bit of development, which I'll talk about in a slide here in a little bit, into kind of zones of African kingdoms in the west, in the south, and the east, especially the oceanic east on the Indian Ocean. So let's go ahead and dive into some of these. I'll start with Korea. And I'm going to give you timelines for a lot of these if you want to look at them. These are from that ancient history encyclopedia. But if you want to look at a timeline of basically all of Korean history, you can go ahead and do that. And it's, you know, perhaps more information than you need, but if you want to look at a specific time, you can feel free to do that here and see what was going on in Korea at that time. I'm just going to talk about really quickly the three kingdoms. This map here is circa around 476 CE, which is the reason that that date or that year is fairly significant is that this is when Goguryeo, which is one of the Korean three kingdoms, being Pakche, Silla, and Goguryeo, is at its largest extent. You can see it's extending far out of what we consider Korea today. The Korean peninsula and modern North Korea ends right around here on this line. And at this time, Goguryeo was actually quite a bit larger, extending further into Central Asia, into the steppe. And this is also one of the potential sources of the word Korea from either the Goguryeo or the Goryeo, which is a later appellation related to it. This is a time in which Korea is starting to gain a lot of Chinese influence. Under the later Silla, so we have these three kingdoms starting out, the Goguryeo, the Bakche, and the Pakche or Bakche and Silla. They're competing for power in the peninsula, all of them with each other. And the first one to really ally with China in a very major way is the Silla. And this helps them take control of the bulk of the Korean peninsula. Their influence ends right about here, right at the end of the Korean peninsula. And the Balhae kingdom, which is kind of in this northern area that was formerly Goguryeo, emerges as a rival that is both Korean and Manchurian and rivaling the Silla. And it is also allied with Japan. So we have Japan and the Manchurians fighting against a unified Silla. Let me see if there's a good map of the later Silla kingdom. Yeah, here we go. So we have the Silla kingdom here competing with the Balhae, who are also allied with Japan, and they have plans to invade Silla, but it never really works out. And so we really start to see a separate Korean identity coalesce and become more solid under the three kingdoms and later the Silla and Goryeo. After the Silla decline in the early 10th century, the Goryeo replaced them. We see further unification on the peninsula, and under the Goryeo, there is further diplomatic ties, which are drawn with the Song dynasty in China, which we haven't gotten to yet. We're getting a little bit ahead here, but because I haven't talked about Korea on its own, and I'm probably not going to talk about Korea on its own all that much, I wanted to make use of my time here to give you a little bit more history. And then after the Goryeo dynasty, in 1392, we see the Joseon, which is a group that discouraged Buddhism in favor of Confucianism exclusively as kind of the state policy and religion, which, Confucianism, not a religion in the same way Buddhism is, but it does involve ancestor worship and also veneration of one's elders in life. And so the decline of Buddhism in Korea occurs during this long Joseon dynasty. It's part of why Buddhism, even today, is significantly more popular in, for example, Japan than it is in Korea, despite similar origins. The story in China is more complicated. It has to do with the Cultural Revolution, but Buddhism was less popular in Korea than it was, I think you could say, either in China or Japan in the kind of early modern period. This is after this class, but this is part of why. And on these slides, feel free to make use of all of these links that I'm giving you. If you're interested in these areas, if you want to study them a bit more directly, I'm giving you all these links and I'm putting these slides together to try to fill in the gaps also in what our textbook talks about and give you a springboard if you want to study these places on your own. Japan, this is my area of particular expertise. I'm an East Asianist in general, but specifically I'm a Japanist, so I know the most about Japan within Asia. Talking a little bit about prehistory in Japan, which is important and a bit different than the rest of East Asia. As I said a few minutes ago, we see a much longer kind of hunter-gatherer / Neolithic period. Japan takes a while to catch up to the Bronze Age, for example. And these periods are called the Jomon, the Yayoi, and the Kofun. And these are periods that are roughly defined by their tombs and their pottery. These are the two pieces of material culture that clearly set the stage for this three sets of periods of prehistory. And the end of the Jomon is a bit debated. The original and long-standing timeline is roughly 300 BCE. This is to say that Japan was essentially, Paleolithic still, or late Neolithic. I'm sorry, early Neolithic until roughly 300 BCE. That's been pushed back to about 1000 BCE due to recent archaeological findings. So I give you both dates here. The Yayoi is this kind of birth of a lot of agriculture. So we start to see wet rice agriculture coming to Japan for the first time during the Yayoi. So this is the later Neolithic, or the Neolithic in Japan. We see the Bronze Age also occurring in the Yayoi. So this is very compressed. In other places, technological developments that happened thousands of years ago and took thousands of years to occur are happening in Japan very quickly, likely due to increased continental contact. So it's relatively easy to kind of import a preset technology, one that's already functioning, and that's what we see happening in Japan here, is they can go from old stone to new stone to bronze in just a few hundred years because they're learning about it from experts in Korea and by proxy China. The Kofun is a period of great Japanese kings. It's a large tomb period. So those large keyhole tombs that I showed you early on, a couple weeks ago, I believe, in the term, those are from this period. Kofun is the name for these large tombs. And so we see competing kingdoms across Japan. There's no one Japan as a concept yet. There are simply lots of little kingdoms in what the Chinese call the islands of Wa. And the kingdom that unifies all of them is Yamato, which is even to this day kind of a nationalistic term for Japan. The Yamato are the first major kingdom to control the bulk of Honshu, which is the main island of Japan. And that essentially means, okay, this is the core of Japan. And then we move into an ancient period with the Asuka and Nara, and then later the Heian. And those should kind of be considered two separate. That's early ancient and later ancient, or ancient and classical, perhaps, would be one way to categorize them. And during these periods, we see shifting capitals and early or nascent, early on imperial regimes. So we start to see emperors instead of kings in Japan, built to rival those in China. The development of Japanese syllabary and written language occurs at this time, although it's really later, it's in the Heian that the written language occurs. And prior to that, the Japanese are exclusively using Chinese to represent Japanese words. The Koreans are doing the same thing. And we also see a shift from queens and kings to emperors and empresses, and then mostly just to emperors. So there is a gendered shift occurring here too, in which women held more power earlier in Japanese history. As a rule, this is also the case. If you're talking about pre-modern Japan, the earlier you go, the more power women had, and the later you go, the more patriarchal the society became. Some of this happened perhaps due to Chinese influence, which is a part of the case, and it also happened due to an increase in warfare and a lack of resources. Meaning, for example, if you have a lot of resources, you can split them evenly among all your children, all your sons and daughters. If you only have a little bit, you might only give it to one child. And so increasingly people were selecting their sons to receive property later on in Japanese history. And so these are some of the big, broad elements of why Japan becomes patriarchal, and perhaps early on was even matriarchal, as we see quite a few empresses, including one of them here, Suiko, probably the first one to be a real person in a list of about 8 or 9. I believe it's 8, but some of them ruled multiple times. So I think it's 8 empresses that ruled 10 or 12 times in early Japanese history, say from around the 5th to 7th century. And these were empresses regnant, meaning they reigned, they had power. You still have an empress later, but she's just the wife of the emperor, right? Which is different than being an empress in power. So we have empresses regnant in early Japan, demonstrating a quite matriarchal or at least equal society between men and women early on in terms of political power, and also things like familial authority. The import of Confucianism may be one part of what starts to shift this. We also see the earliest semi-historical writings from classical Japan. So I say semi-historical, and we're going to look at 3 of them here really briefly. If you're interested in Japanese writing, in maybe looking at a source from Japanese history, you could look at one of these. They're very big, they're very well known. You can find English translations of at least parts of them. The Kojiki from 712 is the first piece of Japanese writing. This is a mytho-historical chronicle, so it has early legends and songs and myths. People like Empress Jingu, who is the mythical counterpart to Empress Suiko. She probably was not a real person. Jingu is probably not a real person, and Suiko may or may not have been a real person. Importantly, Suiko, one of her compatriots at court, or one of her, I suppose, underlings at court, is Prince Shotoku Taishi, who is the also semi-mythical or possibly real, I think he's probably a real person, but some of the things we know about him are semi-mythical. But he is one of the early adopters of Buddhism and is the mythical figure who kind of brings Buddhism to Japan as a religion, as a religious movement. Moving to the second source here, the Nihon Shoki, we're moving here in 720, 8 years later, from the creation myths to the first real historical rulers of Japan. And then the Shoku Nihongi, which takes quite a while to assemble, is a 40-volume history of imperial Japan, covering the years 697 to 791, which is a more grounded historical text dealing with real people and less with myth. And so these 3 texts are quite significant because they show you this shift from prehistory and mytho-history into the earliest historical accounts of Japan by the Japanese themselves. After that, after the Heian period, or we move into the Heian period, which is the really dominant classical idea of Japan, of this world of shining princes and princesses and their court, things like the Tale of Genji, the world's first novel, and some of the earliest poetry of kind of written in Japanese for Japanese consumption starts to really flourish under the Heian. So it's this courtly time in which an imperial court of thousands of people living in an area about the size of an aircraft carrier deck control the country, and kind of live in a separate world from everyone else. And then the medieval period, starting in 1185, represents the earliest overthrow of that court by military figures. And this may be, if you're familiar with the samurai, this is the period of time you're thinking of when you think of old Japan. From about 1185 to 1868 is a period we can just very roughly call the age of the samurai. And this is the age I'm most familiar with, but I'm quite familiar with these other ones too. And we'll get to this maybe a little bit later. I might give you a lecture basically about medieval Japan later on. I haven't decided if I can fit it in or not yet. If I can't, I'll probably give you maybe just one of my old lectures about it. I might just put it up for you. But Japan's medieval period is much later, and it's probably what you think of when you think of old Japan. There's actually a lot more old Japan that predates it. Anyway, sorry to get carried away with the Japan slide here. We'll move right along to Africa. We see the Nubian kingdom of Kush, and I have a nice National Geographic article here for you if you want to read about it. And Meroe, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, is this interesting site. And as the National Geographic says here, it's this rival to Egypt, this Nubian kingdom of Kush that exuded power and gold. And so they had tall, slender pyramids, a little bit different than the Egyptian pyramids. But this just demonstrates there is a broader African set of civilizations that expands outside of this kind of narrow valley of the Nile and coast of the Mediterranean. And so you can read about these a little bit if you want, but the Nubian kingdom also encounters the Islamic invasion that we're reading all about this week. And again, I'm not sure if it's from today's reading or from Thursday's reading, but you'll be reading about this a bit this week. We're going to be going back to Africa as we see the Arab world expanding. We also see Geno. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly either. This is a major archaeological find in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's a relatively recent find. So this is a village of Geno that was abandoned in the 16th century and was not kind of rediscovered until the 1970s. Oh, sorry. And I really like this picture. I'm sorry it's a bit small, but it shows the kind of layers of inhabitants on this site that go back to 250, I believe it's 250 CE, but it might be 250 BCE. It is BCE. And then, you know, there are other civilizations that build over it. This is the case in multiple parts of Africa. Because Africa, if we subscribe to the out of Africa theory, and that's what we're teaching in this course, I think it's accurate, is the source of all humanity, right? And so the OOA theory would tell us then that the oldest human inhabited sites would all be in Africa. And the reason why some of them are hard to get to is because people have built over them over time. This is one of those sites. It's one of the oldest urbanized centers in sub-Saharan Africa. And you can read a little bit about it here at the World Monuments Fund. And so here's my picture, a little bigger. Yeah, I want to show you this picture because I like it a lot. It's in French, but you can see this sedimentation or kind of conglomeration of multiple civilizations on top of each other over time. The Bantu expansion, which was this linguistic expansion that we saw from prehistory onward out of northwestern Africa into southern Africa, has a continuing legacy that endures into the period we're working on today, this kind of negative 500 to positive 500 era. And there are multiple example descendant civilizations from the Bantu expansion. Just one of them is the Swahili Coast civilization. You can read about here a little bit. And this is on the shores of East Africa into the Indian Ocean. And it is known for the kind of trade that we see out of Eastern Africa into the Indian Ocean. And this will also be covered a little bit in the Islamic invasion section of our textbook for today or for this week. We see gradual adoption of elements of Islamic political and spiritual life happening from the 700s to all the way to, say, the 16th century or so. And one example, a separate example from the Swahili coast, this is within the Swahili coast, is the empire or kingdom of the Kilwa. And this is a kingdom that had coins that we see popping up all over the kind of former Arab trade world and into places as far away as Australia, which is really significant because it demonstrates that it's possible that chunks of Oceania, including Australia, were part of this broader trade network. So these Kilwa coins are quite interesting. Here's an article from CNN about them, showing some of the standing ruins of Kilwa. Now we're getting quite a bit further down in history here. These are from the 13th or 14th century. But these coins probably existed from perhaps even a couple of centuries earlier than that. And you can see written here on the coin is this Arabic writing, which I cannot read. But Africa is kind of now churning with multiple civilizations, multiple kingdoms in different regions of the continent, which are sometimes competing with, sometimes interacting with the Islamic world, and sometimes kind of just doing their own thing, just operating their own kingdoms that are successful in their own right. And I wanted to at least point a few of those out. The Africa timeline from this Ancient History Encyclopedia is quite good because it gives you a lot of points of reference. You can see here Geno. If you want to read about it, they have writing all about it here, talking to you about this area of Gen here in Western Africa. But anyway, moving right along into Europe, we've talked about Rome, and we've talked about the Roman Empire, but we haven't really talked much about Northern Europe, at least not since I talked a little bit about megalithic sites like Stonehenge a few weeks ago. We haven't really looked back to Northern Europe all that much since then. We see a burgeoning Celtic culture, which is somewhat politically controversial because Celtic culture is often embellished a bit for nationalistic purposes, you could say. And if you want to learn about this, you could look at the myths of Celticity here. This is a JSTOR article about how it is often for nationalism and white nationalism, indeed, said that things like a Celtic empire may have existed that expanded across most of Europe at various times. More likely, and that is quite unlikely, it is that there are various tribes linked to the Celtic world that operate throughout chunks of Britain and into continental Europe here and there. But the bulk of Celtic culture, of course, centers around the British Isles, and Britain, Scotland, Ireland, etc. And we learn about this a little bit from genetic mapping. So this is an interesting news article from, I know The Independent is not a great source for historical study or anything, but this is a really interesting scientific study of DNA mapping that shows Celtic interaction. And that's kind of the argument they're making here with this map. And as is the case in Japan and Southeast Asia, we know more about the Celts from their rivals or enemies than from their own local sources, which is quite significant. But we do see various tribes begin to appear in Greek and Roman texts from 500 BCE onward. Roman incursions and barbaric counter-invasions are quite significant to talk about because Rome invaded Britain in 43 CE, which is quite well known that Rome invaded Britain, and retained influence, dwindling influence until around 425 CE. Rome kind of famously had its frontier in the center of what is now England here, where I believe this is roughly the line that denotes Hadrian's Wall, where they built fortifications to keep out northerners who they were unable to conquer. And so they built various forts. This is one of the forts, and they built walls. There were a couple of these walls, Hadrian's Wall being the most famous, which were designed to protect British Rome, which we didn't really, I think, see too much in the text, but the text might have talked about it a little bit. The Vikings, a lot of people love talking about the Vikings. They're fascinating people. The origin of the word Viking itself is quite controversial. Some people say it means invaders. Other people say it means people from Scandinavia, essentially, the Viks. But the Vikings is a shorthand term for Scandinavian raiders, generally, who were attacking into this red area, essentially Anglo-Saxon Britain, from the 8th to 11th century, and also traveling throughout Europe and on the Atlantic, even as far as the New World. So I literally, pardon my French, Lance aux Meadows is a quite interesting site because this is the first colony from Europe in the Americas, and it is created by the Vikings in the 11th century. And there are some remnants from this, which you can look at here. So the Vikings are travelers, one of several groups of travelers, and they do make it into the Mediterranean and things like that, but probably more for trade than for conquest, which is not what we usually think of as, these trading Vikings. But they were doing that too, so they were both invaders, traders, explorers, and settlers. And so the term Viking should not evoke simply that they were raiders, but they also had a lot of other things going on. And you can read a bit about them here. This is an interesting little article, Brief History of the Vikings. And this is from BBC History Magazine. And you can also read about them, I believe, both on the Met website and on the Ancient Encyclopedia that I've been linking here today. Oceania is like North America, especially further north than Mexico in North America, quite difficult and often overlooked in terms of ancient history. If you're talking about before the year zero or around the year zero, it's a difficult place to study. And a part of that is quite clearly geographical or environmental, because what we call Oceania is actually a lot of different little places that are linked in many ways culturally and geographically, but are also quite separate in terms of spatial connection to one another. And so the establishment of large-scale settlements is something that's really limited throughout Polynesia and throughout Oceania, and it creates a difficulty in understanding these places historically before much more recent times. And to quote the Met here, I'll just read this to you. The era from 1000 BC to 1 AD marks a period of consolidation and development for the Lapita settlers who first reached the islands of Western Polynesia between 1300 and 1000 BC. By 500 BC, the descendants of these first settlers began to develop the earliest recognizably Polynesian cultures in Samoa, Tonga, and Fiji. Several centuries later, the Polynesians began to venture out into the remote and widely separated archipelagos of the Eastern Pacific, settling the Marquesas and Northern Cook Islands between 200 BC and 1 AD. So during this period that we're talking about today, kind of right smack dab in the middle of the 500 to 500 period, there is still really settlement. Initial migration is still happening in some parts of Oceania, which is another reason why the history is not well established at this time, is because literally the history is not well established at this time. People are still moving around and settling some of these island areas. This is I believe I've talked a couple of times now about the Heilbronn timeline of art history. For Oceania, they have a bunch of really good little mini timelines. So if you're interested in, say, 1 to 500 AD in Oceania, which is kind of right smack dab in the period we're talking about today, they have a nice little article, some key events, and some citations here, or you can make a citation to it, and they may, in some of these cases, have some objects, but in this case, not very many. We have the stone figure tradition in New Guinea, and this is really an excellent resource for your object paper, which we're now, I know, pretty much wrapping up, or you probably have your objects already by now, but this is an excellent one for looking at also if you're interested in oceanic history more broadly. And between 200 and 200, which as you write down in the middle of the Han Dynasty here, we see archaeological evidence of trade from Oceania, or at least from Southeast Asia, into places like China and Southern Europe. We start to see clove, which only comes from Indonesia, which is Southeast Asia, but so we start to see this burgeoning trade network that extends at least into island Southeast Asia, so out of mainland Southeast Asia and into island Southeast Asia, and may have started to extend into places we call Oceania now, especially perhaps Papua New Guinea and Australia, which we know Australia may have been trading with places as far away as Africa, at least a little bit later than this. So we do start to see the islands of the Pacific, I guess we could say, beginning to loop into broader cultural spheres in or around, maybe perhaps slightly after this period. But they also, because they're quite isolated and quite sparsely populated, are just very hard to track historically in their own right. And mytho-history is really at the core of what we know about the early Maori sphere, for example. And so we can look at these two links just very briefly. I know this one has Maui on it, the Moana Maui. I think he's a Lego. I'm not sure. But we do have these Polynesian origin myths appearing in multiple areas of Polynesia at this time, shared across great oceanic expanses between peoples through an oral history. So a lot of what we have is oral history from Oceania at this time. And the human geography article here from National Geographic is also quite good. So if you're interested in Oceania, these are good sources to look at. That's about all I wanted to cover today. Hopefully this has helped to start to fill in the map a little bit. I know I haven't talked about everywhere. For example, I don't think we've talked about Russia, or what is now Russia, really at all yet in this course, but there are just only so many days in a course and only so many lectures, so we're not going to get to every single time and every single place in world history, but I am doing my best to try to fill in some of these gaps today, just a little bit. Next time, we'll have a mini lecture on the foundations of Islam. It'll be really short, I think, because the book, and because I'm having you read a big chunk of the book on Islam, does a really good job of explaining this. It's one of the more comprehensive sections we've read so far on the early Islamic world. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about early Islam, religious beliefs, etc. It might even be as short as 15 minutes. And I also want to talk maybe a little bit about art and the mathematical legacy of the Islamic Empire and the connection between Islamic art and math, which is quite fascinating. In week 8, so next week, your object analysis essay is due. So you should be coming right along with that. Make sure you get it to me. And you will also have a lecture about our student museum next week. So if you haven't gotten me a picture of your object yet, you should have done that by right about the time you're watching this lecture. Please send me a picture of your object so that I can make that lecture. And if I don't get enough submissions, I will have to delay that lecture a little bit. But I'm going to talk about maybe not every single object, but I'm going to highlight maybe a few of them and just do maybe a half-hour lecture on some of the objects from the student museum. Maybe I'll combine some of them if we have some similar ones. I have about 60 of you as my students across the 2 classes. So I'm not going to cover every single object in detail, but I do want to at least run through a few of them. And then on the 3rd of next month, we have short response number 4, which will be about your museum objects just a little bit. And on early Islam, it'll also cover a bit of the kind of textbook stuff that we're looking at for the Islamic Empire. Okay, so that's it for today. I hope this has been helpful, and welcome back from break. I hope this has been a good welcome back to refresh you on all the things we've covered so far. And I will see you on Thursday for the Foundations of Islam.